Today I want to share with you a homemade flavored salt recipe. This makes use of fresh herbs, and it's very easy to make. These can be fresh herbs from your garden, from the grocery store, from the farmer's market, wherever you get your herbs, and you're going to be able to preserve them by making this lovely flavored salt that you can enjoy all winter long. Hi sweet friends, I'm Mary and welcome to Mary's Nest, where I teach traditional cooking skills for making nutrient-dense foods like bone broth, ferments, sourdough, and more. So if you enjoy learning about those things, consider subscribing to my channel, and don't forget to click on the little notification bell below. That'll let you know every time I upload a new video. Now this is a very flexible recipe. You can use any herbs that you want and any additional seasonings that you want. That's why I love making these flavored salts, because you can make multiples with specific herbs that work well with specific dishes. Now the basic recipe is just your fresh herbs and some salt. And then we can add additional flavorings, which we'll talk about in a minute. But for the salt, what I'm using is a fine ground sea salt. But you can use any salt that you like. If you like the pink Himalayan salt, if you like the one that's called real salt, any salt that you like and that you use in your kitchen is fine. Now, I generally like to do a 1-to-2 ratio. 1 cup of salt to 2 cups of herbs, and you just kind of pack them into your measuring cup. And if you decide that you want to use a coarse ground sea salt, as I said, I've got a fine ground sea salt here, you can definitely use a coarse ground sea salt. But if you do, then it's going to be a 1-to-1 ratio. Now what I'm making here is just a very basic all-purpose herbal salt. And I'm going to use some Italian flat leaf parsley. I've also got over here some fresh thyme, and then I've got some fresh oregano. I love oregano. And then I've got a little bit of rosemary. I'm not using a lot of rosemary because rosemary is very strong. And I'll probably not use all the thyme that I have over there as well, because thyme is kind of strong too. But I've just got a couple of sprigs. I've got 3 sprigs of rosemary here. And I really find that to be enough because, as I said, it is strong. It's not something that my husband is super fond of. So you really have to base this on what your palate likes. And for some people, if you overdo it with rosemary, it can taste very soapy to them. So you want to go easy with that, especially the first time you start making herb salts. Go a little easy with your rosemary and to a certain extent with your thyme. And then I've just got the tiniest little bit of basil here. It's just so tiny, literally a tiny handful. It's August here when I'm making this in Central Texas, and my tomatoes and my basil tend to start to peter out in July, so I can eke out a little more basil, but not too much, and we're under water restrictions and all, so, but I do have that little bit. But if your basil is very plentiful, definitely add more if you like it. Now, for the Italian flat leaf parsley, I'm using this particular type of parsley because I like the flavor. It's got a very nice, mild, herbaceous flavor, and it rounds out the herb salt without being overpowering. But I like to add this because, unlike the other herbs, which do have a stronger flavor, parsley, as I said, is a mild herbaceous flavor, plus it's loaded with vitamins and minerals. It's got it's just got so many vitamins, you just think of them and it has vitamins. It's got vitamin A, vitamin C, sort of that elusive vitamin K that's supposed to be very good for us. It's got magnesium and potassium, minerals, and it's just loaded with nutrition. So by adding this into your herb salt, you're also adding a lot of nutrition. Now, your other herbs are rich in nutrition and antioxidants and anti-inflammatory properties and antiviral properties. Herbs are wonderful. So in making this, not only are you making something delicious, you're making something nutritious. And this is a way throughout the winter to be able to include all these herbs that are very rich in vitamins and minerals. And this, as I said, is a very basic, very versatile combination of herbs that can be used pretty much on anything you want. And if you've been with me and you've made ferments in the past, when you're adding the salt to your ferment, you can use this salt, which will really kick up the flavor if you're fermenting something mild, and it will add that extra boost of nutrition. Now also, what I'm going to add is some lemon zest. I'm actually making some chicken tonight that calls for some lemon juice. So before I squeezed out the lemon juice, I zested them. And you can add now these are optional. You can definitely leave them out if you want, but they do add sort of an extra level of flavor and as well as nutrition. The zest of citrus fruit is very rich in antioxidants, so that's a nice feature. But you can add some lemon zest, some lime zest, orange zest, and you would be surprised, even grapefruit zest is terrific. I really like the zest of the grapefruit, so that's something to keep in mind. And it's probably maybe about a half a teaspoon or so. Again, these type of recipes are not written in stone. They're very flexible, and it really boils down to what you have and what you like. Here I'm going to add some red pepper flakes. It's just about a half a teaspoon. I don't go overboard. And then I'm also going to add 1 garlic clove. Now, if you really like garlic, like I do, my gosh, I could just add 6 cloves. But my husband likes, takes it a little easy when it comes to garlic. So I'm just going to start with 1 clove. And I would recommend that you do the same if you've never made this before, and then work up with your next batches to adding in more garlic if you want that. Now, speaking of the garlic, all I'm going to do is remove the stem, the root. The root of the garlic. And the reason is, it's just 1 clove, and I'm going to cut off the root. But I'm not going to remove the skin. And the reason is the skin of the garlic is also very rich in nutrients, just the way the garlic is. So never discard the skin. Save them and use them in various recipes where you're pulverizing things and no one will notice that there's garlic skins in there. But it's loaded with vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, and anti-inflammatory properties, just like the garlic itself. So we're going to put this whole clove of garlic in. It's going to be all chopped up, and we're going to add, we're going to leave the skin on. Now, some other possible combinations are doing a salt where you add some mint. If you're growing mint, and you want to do maybe mint and Italian flat leaf parsley, since that's got a very mild flavor, that is wonderful on lamb, especially if you don't have any mint jelly on hand. If you have a salt that you've made with fresh mint, it's going to be wonderful, and the aroma is amazing as well. Other things that you can do, maybe instead of adding garlic, you can add grated ginger. You could even add a little grated turmeric if you have fresh turmeric, or you could even add in the turmeric powder. And speaking of the turmeric powder and maybe other herbs or spices that are dry, you could grate in some nutmeg. If you're going to make, you could make a small amount of salt and grate in some nutmeg, which is wonderful for using when you're cooking greens. Greens often, if you look at some recipes, will call for nutmeg, especially like cream spinach. So that can be a wonderful combination where you just take the salt and maybe a little flat leaf Italian parsley, since it's mild, as I said before, and then you can grate in some fresh nutmeg, and you're all set with a wonderful spice that's terrific for any greens you may be eating throughout the winter. So definitely experiment. Experiment with the fresh herbs that you have on hand, and then experiment with the different spices that you may want to add, as well as the zest, or you could add some onion. So just experiment and know that this is very flexible. And don't worry about using garlic or onion or things that are very fresh like that and are going to make the salt a little bit wet, because I'm going to show you how you go about drying this, and you don't need any fancy equipment if you don't have it. Now, I just wanted to show you, this was something that I bought. I bought it a while ago, and it's called borsari. Maybe you've heard of it. It says the world's best seasoned salt for meats, poultry, and salads. But I really liked this. And it basically is just an herb salt that also has garlic in it. But the drawback is it was a little pricey. And you can make your own for like, at least less than half of the cost. And especially if you grow your own herbs. And speaking of growing your own herbs, even if you don't have a garden, don't worry about it. Even if you're in an apartment in a city, if you have a balcony, you can, a lot of herbs grow like weeds. And so you can definitely grow them in pots on your balcony if you have one. And if not, just a sunny windowsill. So definitely try your hand at some of these things. But this one contains sea salt, fresh garlic, fresh basil, black pepper, fresh parsley, fresh rosemary, fresh nutmeg, and fresh lemon peel. So as you see, that was the combination that they made. And we're going to make something similar, and it's going to cost a lot less. Alrighty, now how to make this. If you have a food processor or a blender, that's going to go the quickest. And if you, whichever you use, you will have to stop it periodically. I'll show you what we're going to do and, scrape down the sides a little. Another option, which is the very traditional way of making this, as our ancestors made it, was with a little mortar and pestle. Well, actually, I take back the term little, with a fairly large mortar and pestle. The one that I have is little, and so it's not too time productive for me to use a mortar and pestle to do this. But if you do have a mortar and pestle, you'll put in a little salt, you'll put in your garlic, you may want to chop it up a little bit, leave the skins on, you'll put in some of your herbs, and you just start little by little mashing it with the pestle, and then you just keep adding to that. Now, a lot of people don't have those large mortar and pestles. So, and if you don't have a blender and you don't have a food processor, no problem. Another way to do this is to just take some of your salt and just put it on your cutting board. It helps, the little bit of salt helps create friction, which then helps break down the herbs quicker than just chopping them with the knife. And then just take your knife and then just start rocking it across your cutting board with the salt, and just keep going like that. And this is a little time consuming, but if you're in the mood right now, like so many of us are home with a little bit of time on our hands, this can kind of be a relaxing I don't want to say chore because I don't consider it a chore, but it can be a relaxing task to just kind of relax and cut the herbs with the salt and mixing it and cutting it with the salt, which actually makes the job go pretty quickly, all things considered. And you just do that and keep adding to it as if you were doing it in a mortar and pestle, but instead you're just doing it with some salt on your cutting board and your knife. So what I'm going to do is just cut off this little bit of root off the bottom of my garlic, and then I'm just going to give this a little smash to help it along, and I'm going to go ahead and put that in my food processor, and then I'm just going to add a little salt again just to help with the friction of getting that garlic chopped up. And then that's the first thing I'm going to do. I'm just going to give the garlic a whirl to chop it. Well, I'll overlay a picture so that you can see, but the little bit of salt with the garlic clove in there and a little whirl for like 10 seconds in the food processor does a great job at chopping it up. And again, if you have a blender, you can do the same thing. I would imagine the high-speed blenders really work like a charm for this. And then I'm just going to kind of get down what came up onto the sides so that we make sure everything is incorporated as we go through this process. Now, over time, as you do this on a regular basis, you really don't need to measure every time to make sure you have exactly 2 cups of herbs. I just find that the 1-to-2 ratio works well. You may also just like a 1-to-1 ratio. You may like more salt than herbs. So it's really something that you're going to play with and experiment. This is just what I've found in my own personal experience and what the taste that I enjoy. So we'll kind of measure it out today and know that it's about a 2-to-1 ratio, 2 cups of herbs to 1 cup of the fine ground salt. But what I'm going to do is I'm just looking through. This is from my garden. I grow a lot of oregano. If you've been with me on the tour that I took you of with my son when we walked through the garden to show you what's going on over there, you can see my oregano. I'll link to that video. But in any event, where the stems of the oregano are very tender, I'm not worrying about removing the stems. I'm just going to put those right in. They'll be chopped up beautifully. But where I have a little bit more of a woody stem, that I'm going to just pull the leaves off. And now don't throw out the woody stems to your herbs. If you're barbecuing, these can be great thrown onto the cloves. Cloves. I'm thinking about spices. These can be great thrown onto the coals. They can be to impart some nice fragrance and flavor to whatever you're cooking. You can save them with your scraps, your vegetable scraps, to throw into your bone broth. There's just a lot of different things you can do with them. You can throw them into soups and stews, or stuff them in the cavity of chicken that you're roasting. They still have a lot of flavor to them. Yeah, it's very strong. So definitely don't discard your woodier stems. Hold on to those. Well, I've got my oregano in there with the tender stalks. I'm going to go ahead and add in my little bit of basil. And then for my rosemary, I have to think about it for a minute, I'm just going to pull that right off. The rosemary tends to have woody woody stalks. So I'm going to just pull that right off and add that into our cup. And now I'm going to go ahead and add in some thyme. And again, if the stalks are woody, I'm going to pull the leaves off. But if they're very tender and from new growth, I'm just going to put that right ahead and go ahead and put that into my cup. So that's about a cup of the herbs. So I'm going to go ahead and just add that right into my food processor. One little piece got away there. And then I'm going to add just a little bit of salt. Again, this helps with the friction to really get this mixing really well pulverized to make it a fine salt. And then I'm going to go ahead and add in what I had done with that flat leaf parsley on the chopping board here. Alrighty, so we got that all in, and now we'll send this for a whirl. Well, I whirled that for just about 30 seconds, so we get that first batch of herbs nicely chopped up with the salt. And then this is a good time too to go ahead and add in any other little extras, like maybe if you're using some zest, or if you're using some red pepper flakes. If you have a chili maybe that you're growing in your garden, you could certainly add that in. Really, like I said, it's very, very flexible. But we'll get that in. And now, I didn't use all of the thyme because I said that is a little strong. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take half of this parsley, and we'll see if that's a good amount to use. Now, I am going to add in the parsley stems. They are, even though they're not woody, but even though they may seem tough to you, they will pulverize up beautifully. And just like the parsley, which is rich in vitamins and minerals, the stems are too. So we never want to waste, never want to throw any of that out. And adding it into a salt is a great way to use it up. But if for any reason, so you see I'm compressing it, you want a really good packed cup. If for any reason you don't want to add in the stems, again, just add them to your little stem collection here. Since these contain a lot of water, they're best, to just use in cooking. You can, again, stuff the carcass of a chicken. If you're roasting a chicken, you can add them to, you can tie them up and add them, if you want to remove them afterwards, and add them to soups or bone broth, whatever the case may be. If you add them to bone broth, add them in like the last 10 minutes because you don't want to leave a lot of parsley in your bone broth to simmer for the whole 12 hours if you're making beef bone broth, or 6 hours if you're making chicken bone broth, because there are compounds in parsley that can affect your kidneys, and so you don't want to overdo. It's fine to have it in a seasoning salt like this, and that's why parsley is often a condiment rather than something that you would eat as a full-fledged vegetable, because but if you put it in your broth and simmer it for a long time, then your broth would be high in those compounds that could be a little hard on your kidneys, and you don't want to have that. Even though it has all the vitamins and whatnot, it's good to be used, as I said, as a condiment or in some salt like this, but not in a broth that you may be drinking every day. Now that I've got my parsley in, I'm going to go ahead and sprinkle my salt, all the remaining salt, over the top of that parsley, and then we'll put this lid back on and we'll send this for a whirl. And this time we're probably going to whirl this about a minute. You want to make sure that the herbs are very well pulverized with the salt. Now halfway through, maybe about 30 seconds into it, I'm just going to stop my food processor. You'll want to do the same if you're using a blender, and just scrape down the sides or mix things up a little if it's in a blender, so that whatever on the bottom will come up to the top, so that you make sure that this gets very well blended. Well, I whirled this for another 30 seconds for about a total of 1 minute, and look at this glorious green flavored herb salt that we now have. Now in this state right now, the salt is very moist. Now if you want to just use it and leave it like this, you can put it in a jar and store it in your refrigerator and it'll be fine. It'll last almost indefinitely because of the high salt content. However, what I recommend that you do is get a little baking sheet or a little plate, whatever you have handy, and I'd like to put a little parchment paper on mine. And then we're going to spread this out on this baking sheet, and there are a couple of different things you can do at this point. If you want, you can just spread this salt out onto your baking sheet and just leave it on your counter. And then whenever you remember, just sort of twizzle it around a little to make sure that any salt, that is on the bottom, it's just so that everything is drying evenly, and you're just air drying it. That'll take a few days. If you want to speed things up, you can put this in your dehydrator. If you've just used salt and herbs, you'll want to dehydrate it at 110 degrees Fahrenheit. And I would recommend checking. It can take up to 12 hours to be really nice and dry, but I would recommend checking it at 4 hours, because the type of herbs you use, there's a lot of variables. So start checking it at 4 hours. If you've added garlic like we have, then I recommend drying it at 125 degrees Fahrenheit. And again, check it at 4 hours. With the garlic in it, it's probably going to take a little longer. Any of these can take somewhere in the dehydrator 10, 12 hours. But I've also had them dry at 4 hours, depending on what I was using. So that's just a little tip. But with the garlic in it, I do recommend that you do set your dehydrator at 125. Now, what about the oven? Yes, you can dry this in the oven, but I recommend not having the oven on when you do this. If you have a pilot light, great. If you have an electric oven, turn on the electric light. You can even warm up your oven first to whatever its lowest setting is, 150 degrees Fahrenheit, 170 degrees Fahrenheit, or some ovens only go to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. You can turn it on, warm it up a little, but then turn off your oven, and then just with your pilot light or your electric light, put it into your oven, close the door, and it should dry in a somewhat similar time frame to a dehydrator. But periodically, unlike the dehydrator, which is blowing air and making for good circulation, periodically you'll want to open your oven door and just toss the salt around a little bit. Well, I've got this all spread out and ready to let it dry. You're going to love doing this. making this. This is just smells so incredibly fragrant. So I'm going to let this dry, and then once it's all dry, I'll bring you back and I'll show you how we bottle it up and make it shelf stable. Well, I let this dry in my oven overnight, and what I did was I turned my oven on to 170 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the lowest setting that it'll go down to. And then I turned it off. And then I turned on the electric light because I have an electric oven. And then I put in my salt, just like this, put it into my oven and closed the door. So the oven is off, but it's been warmed up a bit, and then the electric light is turned on. And before I went to bed, I came into the kitchen, opened the oven, and I tussled the salt around a little to make sure that whatever might be on the bottom would now be on the top and dry thoroughly. And then come morning, it's beautifully dry. So you can easily do this, like I said, on your counter if you're willing to go a few extra days, or in an oven that's been turned off but with the light on. Now, I want to show you when you look at your, I want to do this gently because it'll easily fall apart. When you look at your salt in the morning, you might have some little chunks like this that when they've dried together, you know, in a little chunk. Now, don't worry about that. If you want, you can whirl it again in your blender or in your food processor, or you can just literally, if you just push them between your fingers, they're just going to disintegrate. So that's definitely something you can just, oops, some of the salt went flying. You can just get in there with clean hands and then just twizzle all the little pieces around. And as you see, I'll take a picture so you can see, but when you rub it between your fingers, it just turns right into the herbed salt. The other option is you can just take your wooden spoon and just go around and gently press on those little chunks and they'll immediately disintegrate. But you know what? You don't even really need to worry about it, because if you're like me and you're the kind of person who takes a little salt in between your fingers and then sprinkles it on in whatever way you're using this, that's all going to fall apart very quickly once you put it between your fingers. Now, let's talk about how to store this. This is shelf stable. So you can put this in a jar and just put a lid on it and put it in your pantry or keep it by near wherever you like to cook. I'm just going to put mine in this crock, and then I'm just going to put this, I don't worry about it being airtight. It's salt, and salt is such an amazing preservative that you don't have to worry about it going bad. And in terms of maybe losing its strong, pungent flavor, I really never found that to be the case. I found that this will stay fresh and pungent for a good year, even just stored in this type of little crock that doesn't have any air seal at all. So probably if you put it in one of those swing top type jars that have the rubber seal, that would really preserve the flavor and pungency, aroma, so on and so forth. I would think for a very long time. I would think the same with any kind of screw top lid, although not as tight as those with the rubber seal, certainly, you know, tighter than my crock. So that's definitely something to consider. So now we'll just transfer this very carefully. And this is why I like to use the parchment, because I find it's very easy to transfer it to whatever vessel that I want to store this in. And I'm just going to keep this right by my stove. And there you go. Look at that. Beautiful homemade herbed salt. You can't go wrong with that. Now, if you would like to learn how to make bouillon, where you can make a bone broth bouillon or a chicken bouillon or a vegetable bouillon, be sure to click on this video over here, where I have a playlist that'll show you how to make all of those, and they're all shelf stable, just like the herb salt, and you'll never have to buy bouillon cubes again. And I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country kitchen. Love and God bless.